Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Welcome back to my kitchen. Today, I am breaking my silence on baking simple sourdough with whole grains and freshly milled flour. Now, I haven't really been silent on this matter, but this part of my channel is about making sourdough simple. And there is simply nothing simple about baking sourdough with whole grains or freshly milled flour. Now there's a reason for this. Back in the day, when we learned to mill flour to extract mostly just the carbohydrates and starches from it, and thus we figured out how to bake white bread, all breads were whole grain. And all of those breads were dense, chewy, and people loved it because it was bread. It was the only thing they had. And they learned to appreciate it for its flavor and its density. Way back before milling machines were invented and grain was ground by hand to bake bread, virtually all bread was made with freshly milled grains because it took a lot of time to mill that grain by hand. And those breads were even denser and tougher than the subsequent loaves made from milled whole wheat flour. And this is because with the invention of mechanized milling, we could grind a lot of grains at one time. And this meant people would buy big old bags of that grain. And they discovered that the longer it took them to get through that bag of grain, the better and lighter and airier their bread was becoming. That is how we discovered that old flour bakes better bread than fresh flour. Now wait. I am going to demonstrate later on in this video how you can get an entirely acceptable loaf of simple sourdough using your home milled flour or whole wheat flour. But before we get there, I have to explain to you why. Because I am the ultimate food geek and cooking is not just about following instructions, it is also about
science! Oh, science!
Science! It's science!
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 Science?
It's science!
Yes, science!
So do not skip ahead through this next part because it is important for you to understand this information. And I'm going to explain it in the clearest and most entertaining way I know how. This is a seed, a wheat seed to be precise. Well, actually it's not a wheat seed at all. It's made out of a piñata and expanding foam. But it'll do. Inside of the grain of wheat, here at the bottom of the seed, we have what is called the germ. This is the baby wheat plant that is lying in stasis, waiting for the seed to get wet so that it can germinate. The majority of the seed is made up of what we call the endosperm, and these are complex carbohydrates and starches that are going to act as the pantry to feed this tiny baby plant in the first days and weeks of its birth. This stuff is what makes up the vast majority of white flour, whether it's unbleached or bleached, all-purpose, bread, cake, semolina, or any of the other kind of flours that we have on the market. The outer covering of the seed is called the pericarp. Once it's ground up, we call it bran. Its purpose in life is to protect that seed through the harsh winter until temperature and humidity conditions are just right for our germ to begin growing into a new plant. And the bran takes its job very, very seriously. It is angry and hard and defensive, and it is not going to let go until it is absolutely soaked in water for a really long period of time. And even then, it still wants to do its job of protecting the seed, so much so that it typically hangs on to the leaves of the young plant as it's growing and doesn't blow off until later. Whole grain flour is a mixture of all three of these parts. But the only part of the seed that has the potential to produce the gluten network, which is what gives us a beautiful rise and a soft texture in our bread, is the endosperm. Meanwhile, the bran and the germ make up anywhere from 15 to 18% of whole grain flour. This means that right off the bat, a cup or 5 ounces of whole grain flour is going to be able to produce 15 to 20% less gluten, which is what we need to make our bread have a nice texture. And this is what is known as the gluten potential. The more endosperm in the flour, the higher the gluten potential. The endosperm is the only thing that has gluten potential. So when our flour is only made up of 85% of this and 15% the rest, we have less potential to produce the network that traps gas and makes our bread nice and airy. Now, once we discovered how to isolate the endosperm and produce white flour, our breads became soft and fluffy and luxurious. And we got used to that, and we liked it. But then our doctors in the 60s and 70s started telling us we need to have more whole grains in our diet. So we started to reintroduce whole grain flours into the bread making process, but people didn't like them as much because they did not have that light and airy texture. There's something else working against our gluten structure when we use whole grain flours that include the bran. The bran cannot be milled as finely as the endosperm. This means the particles of bran are larger in the flour, and because they are not made up of soft, pillowy starch and are instead made up of hard plant fibers, when we mill them, they're tiny, sharp little shards. So the gluten structure in our bread as it rises is made up of bubbles of carbon dioxide that are produced by the yeast. And as these bubbles stretch and the bread rises, the walls of the bubbles get thinner and thinner. So when they come up against one of those angry bran shards, the bubbles burst and the bread sinks and becomes heavy and dense. There are two ways to counteract this phenomenon. First is to have so much yeast in our dough that we've got a ton of carbon dioxide being pumped into it. And that works way better with commercial yeast than it does with sourdough starters. And it works way better with starters that are kept in a hyperactive state constantly so that we have billions of active cells of yeast. This means we have to keep our starter at room temperature and feed it on a regular basis, which involves a lot of discard and is wasteful. And those of you that follow my channel know we don't feed our starter until we get low and need to make more because it lives in the refrigerator. And we intentionally use sleepy starter to cultivate long, slow fermentations that build flavor. So this is the first reason why whole grain flours, including freshly milled flour, are not good for simple sourdough, because we're not starting off with a ton of yeast. We slowly cultivate that yeast colony within the dough over a long, slow process. So we build lots of flavor. But there is not a huge ton of gas production like there is when you use a hyperactive, robust starter. Plenty of people on the internet teaching those techniques, and you certainly don't need another one. The second way to counteract those bubbles bursting is to increase the amount of water in the dough, because water acts as a lubricant. And the more water the bran can absorb, the less sharp its edges become. But more water needs more gluten strength built up in the dough in order for the dough to hold on to the carbon dioxide as it is being produced. A wet dough just lets the carbon dioxide go unless you have hyper-developed that gluten to make sure it traps every last little bit of bubble that's produced. High hydration doughs require all of those strength-building interventions, all of that coiling, slapping, folding, twisting, all of the things that you have to do at regular intervals, especially during the first fermentation process, to build the strength of the dough. Plenty of people on YouTube teaching high hydration techniques. People tune into my channel to figure out how they can do it easy without all that stuff. So, we have learned that whole grain doughs require more yeast and higher hydration, neither of which lead to a simple loaf of sourdough bread. And this is why you will never see a recipe from me that contains 100% whole grain, because there is simply no way to make that process easy and effortless, which is why people tune in to me. But then there are those of you out there, and God bless you, you message me every day asking me why your home-milled flour isn't making a good loaf of bread. So let's go back a little bit earlier when I told you the invention of mechanized milling processes made it possible for people to buy large amounts of flour at one time. And the longer that flour sat around, the better loaves of bread that it made. It wasn't until the 1900s that we discovered why. As flour sits around, two things happen to it. First of all, it dehydrates. Moisture evaporates out of it. The water component in our dough is important for establishing the gluten structure because flour naturally creates a gluten structure as it hydrates or absorbs water. So we want our flour to be as dry as possible when we begin to make bread, because we can then add the most amount of water to it that we can to make a workable dough, and thus have the most robust gluten structure. So flour that has been freshly milled has a higher moisture content than flour that's been sitting around for 3 or 4 weeks. Thus, it can absorb less water. Thus, it has a smaller gluten potential than that same flour if it had dried out. So not only do we have the problem of 15% of that flour is stuff that has no gluten potential, right? We also have the problem of it cannot absorb enough liquid to further increase its gluten potential. The second thing that happens to flour as it ages is that it oxidizes. Molecules in the flour react with oxygen in the air, which early mechanized millers discovered made the flour whiter. Well, we went through a whole era where white ingredients were super trendy, and any dish that was super white was coveted. But as those molecules reacted with oxygen, it hyper-optimized two proteins that exist in the endosperm of flour, called gliadin and glutenin. These two proteins are the proteins that come together and link up to produce gluten, which is what holds the carbon dioxide inside our bread. And when these two subproteins have oxidized, it makes it much easier for them to come together and link up. Now, that higher oxidation level can be achieved in one of two ways. We can leave the flour out, and apparently 2 to 3 weeks is about standard for optimum oxidation, or we can expose the flour to a chemical bleaching agent like chlorine or bromine. This chemical bleaching of the flour, while it incurs the extra expense of having to maintain these chemicals, is actually cheaper for manufacturers to do. Because the only other alternative is to let the flour sit around, which requires a lot of storage space and time that your product isn't making its way onto shelves to be bought. This is why when you see unbleached flour on the shelf, this is flour that the manufacturer stored for 2 to 3 weeks until it had properly oxidized, and then they packaged it and shipped it off to the grocery store. But it is cheaper to achieve this process through chemical bleaching. Clearly, there is no whole grain flour out there that gets bleached. All of the whole grain flour that you buy on the shelf at the supermarket has been aged to achieve that ideal oxidation process. So, freshly milled flour has neither oxidized nor dehydrated. So any loaf of bread made from it is going to be denser, heavier, and flatter than a loaf made with commercially purchased whole wheat flour or flour milled at home that has been allowed to age and thus dehydrate and oxidize. So, why is there this crazy trend of people wanting to mill flour at home? There are two reasons, and the first one, and it's the one that is usually cited by most people, is that freshly milled flour is healthier than flour that's been sitting on the supermarket shelf. And those people are not wrong. Freshly milled flour has a higher vitamin, enzyme, and micronutrient content than flour that's been sitting for 3 weeks. But that's not the whole story, because the baking process destroys vitamins and enzymes. So while freshly milled flour may be at its most nutritious right when it comes out of the mill, when it comes out of the oven, it's no different than a bag of whole wheat flour that you bought at the supermarket in terms of its vitamin content. Now, minerals, on the other hand, they don't change at all. You have the same mineral content in your flour at the moment that it's milled, 3 weeks later after it's oxidized and aged, and after it comes out of the oven, because the baking process and aging process do not destroy minerals, but they definitely destroy vitamins and enzymes. What this means is, a loaf baked with freshly milled flour is no more or less nutritious than a loaf baked with aged whole wheat flour. Period. You lose those vitamins during the baking process. So if your whole reason for milling your flour at home is that it's more nutritious, you're destroying all that nutrition in the oven. Now, the second reason people mill their flour at home is because they can get specific grains from a specific farm in a specific location. And that is a valid reason to mill your flour at home. Knowing where your food comes from and how it was raised definitely has value for those who can afford it. And if that is your primary reason for milling your grains at home, you will get better results from your freshly milled flour if you let it sit for 3 weeks before you bake with it. The resulting bread is going to be just as nutritious, but it will have a better, lighter texture. Now, while we are talking about specialty grains, a lot of you out there are baking with ancient grains or heritage wheat, spelt, einkorn, emmer, kamut. These are the original strains of wheat that we improved from basically grasses back during the dawn of civilization. Humans selectively bred the grasses that had the biggest seeds, that were the easiest to grind, and baked the best bread. And they took this one great plant that produced great seeds, and they took this other great plant that produced great seeds, and they made them have babies, and then they used those seeds to continually improve. Now, we've been doing this process for thousands of years now. Genetic modification didn't just start. We have deliberately been interfering with our crops since we first discovered that we could grow crops. But these ancient grains have been crossbred fewer and fewer times. Our modern wheat has been selected to have a very high protein content, and the higher the protein in the endosperm, the better gluten structure we get. But those ancient grains had a much lower gluten potential. So you must understand that if you're trying to bake that perfect loaf of einkorn bread, even if you're using white einkorn without any of the bran or germ, you are going to have a lower gluten potential because the plant just has a lower protein content. So if you want that big, beautiful, tall loaf with that perfect light texture, but you're using an ancient grain that has a much lower gluten potential than the modern flours which produce a loaf like that, you're not gonna have your cake and eat it too. So the moral of the story is, if you are baking with whole wheat flour, freshly milled flour, or ancient grains, whether you're baking with whole grain flour or white flour from those ancient grains, you must not expect to achieve that same rise and interior texture as the loaves that you were seeing everybody else on the internet bake, because they are using modern flour that naturally has a higher gluten potential. So, what can we do about it? Well, the most logical answer is to use a portion of whole grain or freshly milled flour so that the majority of the flour has a higher gluten potential and helps balance out the lower gluten potential of whole grain flours and freshly milled. That's why in my simple sourdough recipe, I tell you, you can substitute up to 8 ounces of whole grain flour while adding a little bit more water to account for that thirstiness of the bran and to provide a little extra lubrication to help counter that whole balloon popping phenomenon. And people have been substituting regular commercial whole grain flours up to 8 ounces in my loaves with pretty good success. Of course, it doesn't rise as high as a loaf made with entirely white flour, but it works. What doesn't necessarily produce an acceptable loaf is using an 8-ounce substitution of freshly milled flour, and I'm going to do a quick demonstration of that to show you. But wait, because I have found out how to cheat Mother Nature and produce a significantly higher loft on a loaf made with freshly milled flour. But first, watch this demonstration. All right, I am going to weigh out about 8.5 ounces of hard red winter wheat into my Vitamix. Now, I am well aware that the Vitamix is not the ideal choice for the home miller. Some of you spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on your grain mills. And yes, you can achieve a slightly better gluten potential with an effective level of starch destruction in a proper mill, but not enough to make a spectacular difference unless you're sifting your flours and removing a certain portion of the bran. And remember, my channel is all about simplicity. So I'm going to grind this down to as fine a flour as I can achieve using my Vitamix. Most folks criticize the Vitamix because it heats up the flour, which does lead to some vitamin degradation. But remember, that vitamin level is going to reduce as soon as that bread goes into the oven and gets fully baked. So it does not matter whether we reduce the vitamins now with heat in the Vitamix or reduce them in the oven through baking later. All right, now I'm going to mix up a quick batch of simple sourdough. And folks, if you don't follow me already, I'm not explaining a lot about this process because it is very well documented on my other videos, in particular my masterclass. So we got 4 ounces of 100% sourdough starter, super sleepy, straight from the fridge, hasn't been fed in weeks. Now, normally I say when you modify my recipe for whole grain flour, you need to add a full extra ounce of water. But because freshly milled flour has a higher moisture content, we're only going to add half of an extra ounce of water. And now we are going to add 8 ounces of our freshly milled flour. And I've got 12 ounces of all-purpose flour here. And yes, if you were using bread flour, you would get a higher gluten potential. So bread flour is preferred if you're mixing it with whole grain flour. And 7/10 of an ounce of salt. The higher salt content is discussed in my masterclass. It's one of the reasons this recipe is so flexible. All right, now I'll get those mixed together and use my hand to bring it all together. Now, this dough naturally feels a bit stickier than my regular simple sourdough, simply because it's got an extra ½ ounce of water in it. But as the bread hydrates, a lot of that extra water is going to be absorbed by the bran, so the dough is going to feel considerably less wet tomorrow. Now, I am going to rise this in an oil Ziploc bag so that we can really see gas production and the rising of the crumb. And I've got this bag labeled fresh because I'm also going to mix up another loaf using commercial whole wheat flour and 1 full extra ounce of water in the recipe, just so that we can compare them side by side. Should be interesting. it's immediately noticeable how much thirstier this commercial whole wheat flour is. Even though there's half an ounce more of water in this recipe, it's taking longer to incorporate all the flour into the dough because it's so much drier. And so it begins, a tale of two loaves, one with freshly milled and one with store-bought whole wheat flour. And the time-lapse camera will teach us what happens overnight. All right, it has been 20 hours and both of our doughs have doubled. The store-bought whole wheat flour dough has produced a little bit more carbon dioxide than the freshly milled flour did, but both doughs look pretty decent. Now remember, the dreaded balloon razor blade phenomenon? As these doughs are expanding, with ever-enlarging gas bubbles, the flakes of bran are also slicing those gas bubbles. So while we see a fairly pleasant rise in our dough right now, that just means that more of these bubbles have been damaged and will not be able to recover themselves during the second rise, because they've been sliced through by that bran. The unfortunate truth about baking with whole wheat dough is that the first rise is always the best. But now I'm going to shape, rise, and bake both of these loaves, and we'll see how they turn out. At this point, I want to share something that I have learned from testing literally hundreds of whole grain variations of simple sourdough. I have noticed that when I slightly underproof my whole grain doughs on the second rise, that I get a better rise in the oven. For my white flour doughs, it normally takes 16 to 24 hours for them to double. I shape them, I proof them for 90 minutes, and then I put them in the cold oven to bake. For my whole grain doughs that take between 16 and 24 hours to double, I shape and I rise only 1 hour before I put them into the cold oven to bake. Now, if you're not familiar with my regular method, yes, we put our bread into the cold oven to bake. We don't use a preheated oven. My goal is to make this process as simple and energy conservative as possible. Just remember, though, how delicate those little bubbles of gas are inside our whole grain doughs. Remember the balloon with the razor blade? As those bubbles are expanding in the oven, they become even more susceptible to being sliced by a grain of bran. So getting the loaf into the oven just a little bit earlier than we would for white flour doughs that contain no sharp bran particles means those bubbles are just a little bit smaller than we would normally want for a properly proofed dough. But as the oven is gradually preheating, the metabolic process of the yeast also increases, producing even more tiny bubbles, which expand as the dough matrix heats. Now, if you are adapting my method to using a hyperactive starter that you keep at room temperature and feed and discard on a regular basis, all of the proof times in my videos are thrown out the window for you guys. But just remember that you want to correspondingly underproof your whole grain doughs on the second rise, so they're going to go into the oven in less time than they normally would for an all-white flour dough. If you're getting super confused by this talk, just expand the video description directly underneath this video for all the details you need clearly written out, and a link to my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com, where you can print all of this off so you don't have to keep coming back to the internet every time you want to bake. Straight from the oven, we can instantly see that the freshly milled loaf just didn't get quite as lofty a rise as the loaf baked with commercial whole wheat flour. Let's get these babies out of these hot Dutch ovens so we can get a closer look. Seen from a lower angle, it is obvious we did not get nearly as good a rise with our freshly milled grain as we did with our commercial whole wheat. This loaf actually doesn't look too bad, but there's gotta be a way we can do better with this. We know that freshly milled flour does not build as good a gluten structure because the subproteins that create gluten have not oxidized. That happens naturally through the aging process with exposure to oxygen. But what if there was a way for us to oxidize those subproteins as the dough was fermenting so that we could still have the convenience of milling our flour just before we bake it, not having to keep it sitting around for 3 weeks before we can use it, but still have a decent rise to our flour? Well, it turns out there is a wholesome ingredient that we can use to oxidize our subproteins. And that ingredient is, ironically, an antioxidant. I am talking, of course, about ascorbic acid, or vitamin C. Yes, folks, that vitamin supplement that you overdose on at the first sight of a sniffle can make your freshly milled bread significantly better. And while it works in your body as an antioxidant to protect your cells from free radicals, if we can figure out a way to expose our vitamin C to a significant amount of oxygen just before we mix it into our bread dough, additional compounds in our wheat flour will make vitamin C do the exact opposite of its natural behavior. It becomes an oxidant, rapidly oxidizing the subproteins gliadin and glutenin in our flour and making them able to link up into much, much stronger bonds. Turns out it doesn't take much of this stuff, like 1/8 of a teaspoon per loaf, to significantly improve the gluten structure of our bread. So, I'm going to show you how to mix up a loaf and incorporate some ascorbic acid, which is easily purchasable at health food stores or on Amazon. It will boost the vitamin content of your bread, which we know already gets depleted by the heat of the oven, and everyone will be happy. First thing is our sourdough starter, exactly like normal, 4 ounces. Next, I am going to take a quart jar, zero my scale, and measure into it 12.5 ounces of my filtered water. Now, vitamin C is not super soluble in water. If you've ever tried to crush up a vitamin C tablet and stir it around in water, you know that that's the case. We still want to get it evenly distributed throughout our dough, and we want to expose it to as much oxygen as possible, because that extra oxygen is what helps us flip its status from antioxidant to oxidant. We are going to add 1/8 of a teaspoon of ascorbic acid or vitamin C powder to our loaf. And I don't have 1/8 of a teaspoon measuring spoon. They do make them, but I don't use measuring spoons a lot. So I'm just going to use 1/4 of a teaspoon measuring spoon and measure out about half of that and drop it into my water. Now, I'm going to close that quart jar and wildly shake this water to get as much oxygen into it as humanly possible. And yes, you can hyperoxygenate water. Think about the aquarium stone that blows oxygen through the water at home in your aquarium to make sure the fish have enough dissolved oxygen in that water to breathe. After a good healthy arm exercise, we are going to dump this into our starter and continue the recipe exactly like normal. Eight ounces of our just milled hard red winter wheat, 12 ounces of all-purpose flour, and of course bread flour will give you a higher rise if you've got bread flour, and 7/10 of an ounce of salt. Salt strengthens our gluten network. Ascorbic acid improves the ability of gluten to link up. Now, just so that we have something to compare this to, I'm also going to mix up the basic recipe of simple sourdough using all-purpose flour and no whole grain flour, so that as we go through our taste test tomorrow and our very careful comparisons, we've got something to compare the whole grain loaves to. Now, ascorbic acid is a very common dough conditioner in many commercially manufactured breads, but I am not putting any ascorbic acid into this all-purpose loaf. We're just going to directly compare the freshly milled loaf with and without ascorbic acid. All right, these babies are going up to the time-lapse camera, and we will see what happens to them tomorrow. All right, these have risen for 17 hours, and they look pretty good. As you can see, we've got fairly decent gas production in both the freshly milled loaf and the all-purpose loaf. And it's pretty cold in Texas right now, so that's fairly good for 17 hours. It is time for me to shape. Now, because I normally proof my all-purpose loaves for about 90 minutes before baking, I'm going to shape this one now. I'm going to wait another 30 minutes to shape my freshly milled loaf. And that's because I like to slightly underproof my whole grain loaves for a better oven rise. I'll be back when these babies are baked, then we're going to slice into all the loaves we made and have a taste. And here we have our final lineup, folks. This is our first attempt at freshly milled bread, and this is after we changed nothing but adding 1/8 of a teaspoon of vitamin C. So clearly, bread lacks vitamin C. we got a significantly higher rise, and when you compare the loaves right next to each other, the difference is pretty stark. When we compare the freshly milled loaf to the grocery store whole wheat flour loaf, we got a slightly taller rise with that vitamin C on the freshly milled. This means we could probably improve the store-bought whole wheat flour loaf if we added a little bit of vitamin C to it as well. Of course, would we compare the freshly milled loaf to a loaf made entirely with all-purpose flour? I mean, the freshly milled loaf never stood a chance, of course. And that's because a good percentage of the flour we added in here is just not food for the yeast. Less food and less gluten is always going to mean a smaller, denser loaf. But we've got to look inside them and taste them before we get the final overall impression. We pretty much know what to expect from the freshly milled loaf, but we got to cut into it anyway, just to see how bad it is. And of course, we've got a very compact, dense crumb, but smells good. Sure, it tastes great. Now let's check out the inside of the vitamin C freshly milled loaf. A much lighter structure, and also smells great. And while the original loaf has staled for a day, I did heat it back up, but it still doesn't have nearly the sponginess of the vitamin C loaf. Let's take a look at the commercial whole wheat flour loaf that we baked yesterday. To be honest, even though its volume is the largest of any of these three loaves, the crumb is considerably denser than the loaf with freshly milled flour in which we included vitamin C. So we can clearly see that the ascorbic acid is definitely a benefit for whole grain baking. And just for comparison, we've got to cut into the all-purpose flour loaf, and it cuts like a cloud. It has almost a cake-like interior compared to the whole grain loaves, and of course this is the texture that we are somewhat spoiled to once processed white flours became the predominant flour for commercial bread makers. And this is why it can be hard to go backwards into the denser structures of the whole grain loaves. But I definitely want to do a direct comparison of the flavor of the freshly milled grain bread as opposed to the commercial whole wheat flour bread. I'm going to try the freshly milled first. Actually, the texture on this is great. It's soft, not dense, not overly moist, not overly chewy. And it has a really lovely, warm, earthy, nutty flavor. Now for the store-bought whole wheat. Interesting. We definitely have more overall depth of flavor and complexity of flavor in the freshly milled loaf. But I do have to say, there's something that's very familiar about the store-bought whole wheat loaf flavor that almost makes me prefer this on its own. However, if you asked me which of these two breads I would want to have some fresh butter on, it would definitely be the freshly milled loaf. Still, we have learned that an 8-ounce substitution of whole grain flour, whether you mill it at home or buy whole wheat flour at the grocery store, gives an entirely edible loaf of bread with the simple sourdough method. If you're using freshly milled flour, that 1/8 of a teaspoon of ascorbic acid or vitamin C powder shaken up in 12.5 ounces of filtered water yields a fantastic loaf. For commercial whole wheat flour, 13 ounces of water is necessary, and a little of that ascorbic acid would probably give it a nice boost as well. Beyond this, the best advice I can give you is to slightly underproof your loaf before it goes into the oven. Do not expect it to look as tall and perky as an all-white flour loaf, because it won't. Because we want to get it in the oven before it gets that tall and perky, before those bubbles burst. If you have found this video helpful, educational, or at least mildly entertaining, I really hope that I've earned your subscription today, especially if this is the first of my videos that you've watched. In my world, sourdough is almost effortless. We keep our starter in the fridge. We only feed it when we get low and need to make more. When we mix together a loaf of bread, there's no kneading, there's no slapping or folding or turning. We just ignore the bread until the next day. Then we shape it, put it in the Dutch oven, and stick it into a cold oven to bake. Yes, exceptionally delicious sourdough incorporating whole grains is possible with my simple sourdough method. Please take a second to browse through my channel. I'm sure I've got a video out there that's just right for you. I've also got a website, ultimatefoodgeek.com, where you can print off all of these recipes and explore all sorts of new techniques that can benefit you in the kitchen and beyond. I'm Ben Starr, the Ultimate Food Geek. Thanks for watching.